All right, good. Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get our event started here. Thank you all for coming today. We are live streaming this, so this will be available as a recording if you want to go back and view it later. My name is Michael Van Beek. I'm the Director of Research at the Mackinac Center, and we're very happy that you've chosen to join us today. This is another Issues and Ideas Forum. We put these on in Lansing on a regular basis, and I'm really excited about the topic today. This is going to be very interesting. How free are we? Where Michigan ranks on the freedom scale. Have you ever thought about this? How free are you actually to direct the course of your own life? There's lots of rules and barriers and laws and boundaries about what we can and cannot do. How does that compare? How would it compare? How free would you be if you lived in a different city or a different state or even a different country, different society? How free are we compared to our ancestors and the kinds of restrictions that they faced in their lives? Well, I imagine some of you have wondered this before, and that's maybe one of the reasons why you're here. So welcome, and I hope we'll scratch that itch for you. Thomas Paine once said, in 1777, during the Revolutionary War, he said, "Those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must undergo the fatigue of supporting it." That's what this presentation is about, in a way. So thank you for undergoing the fatigue of supporting freedom. With us today, we have two excellent researchers and experts who've studied this issue very closely and very systematically. Freedom is a term that means lots of different things in the way that we use it in today. It's probably overused, and in politics, you might say it's overused and abused. It means sometimes people use it to mean the opposite of what it actually means. So to study freedom, you have to be very careful in how you categorize and label the things that you're trying to study. And that's what these researchers have done. Our panelists are William Ruger and Jason Sorens. William is the president of the American Institute for Economic Research. He earned his PhD in politics from Brandeis University and has published widely in academic journals and is an officer in the U.S. Navy and served in Afghanistan. Jason is a senior research faculty also at the American Institute for Economic Research. He earned his PhD from Yale University, where he also taught, in addition to teaching at Dartmouth. He also founded the Free State Project, and if you know anything about that, you know that he lives in New Hampshire. Before we get to our panelists, so one quick note. At the end of the presentation, we're going to have time for question and answers. So if you have a question for the panelists, please jot it down on one of the cards that are available on the tables there. And then we'll collect those, and I can ask the questions from the podium here so that people viewing the live stream and the recording can hear the questions as well. So with that, William, take it away, please.
Great, thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be here in Michigan. So I was actually born in New Hampshire, so I was a pre-stater. But yeah, think about that for a sec, right? And on my mother's side, they go way back in New Hampshire history. But on my dad's side, I actually have a connection to Michigan. So my great-great-grandfather and grandmother are from Fairgrove, Michigan. I don't know if anybody knows where Fairgrove is. You might have missed it. It's in the thumb, yeah. It's a very small township up near, not that far from Saginaw. So I do have a connection to Michigan here. And it's great to be here at Mackinac and in the state capitol here. Again, it's my first time to Lansing, so it's exciting. And hopefully we'll have a good conversation about what freedom is and how Michigan is doing. Because one of the advantages of our study is that it's very easy to think about yourself in a vacuum, right? To think about, well, what are we doing here in Michigan? But it's really important to see how you're doing relative to others. And we'll talk more about that in the course of this. The other thing I wanted to do is send a shout out to the Cato Institute, because while Jason and I are both at the American Institute for Economic Research, the study is published by the Cato Institute, and we're very happy with them as our publisher and an institution that itself is committed to a free society. And so it's a nice, again, I think the ecosystem of liberty-oriented institutions is on display here especially because one thing we'll talk about, and I'll give credit to Jason for this because he mentioned it this morning, which is that I think Mackinac has had a big effect on freedom and the state of freedom in Michigan. And our study actually, I think, bears that out. And so that's why it's also exciting to be partnering with Mackinac today. So here's basically what we're going to do. We'll talk a little bit about how and why to measure freedom, talk about the data. Jason will geek out on some of the measurements, but hopefully not too much. But then we'll talk about the results and the consequences and a little bit about the good, the bad, and the ugly about Michigan. So how and why to measure freedom? So why do we want to measure freedom? Well, freedom has intrinsic value, right? But it also is an important instrumental effect, right? So it impacts economic growth. It impacts things like whether people move, or at least it's an open question. Does it actually? And not to steal the thunder from later, it does. It has a big effect, as you might guess. If you've read Adam Smith, you know that. But it's also useful for a lot of different audiences, right? So it's helpful for legislators to know where they stand, how they're doing relative to other states, what types of policies are other states pursuing that you might want to pursue. It helps people decide where they might want to move. So, Jason moved from New York to New Hampshire from, I'll tell you where New York lands a little later and where New Hampshire lands, but very different states. So people could vote with their feet. Corporations might want to look at this type of index, among many other things, of course, in terms of making decisions about where they might relocate. We have seen a lot of relocation of businesses in America. Places, corporations from California, for example, voting with their collective feet to places like Texas. And then also just, you think about academics, scholars, because it's important to kind of try to understand the world around us. And the data that we provide is helpful for analyzing a lot of different things. We've had a lot of scholars using our data set, using our study to measure all kinds of number of things that political scientists and economists look at. So why should we study states, right? So we've heard this story about the fact that federalism is in decline. It's been in decline maybe since the beginning, but certainly since the Progressive Era and the New Deal. But states still have a lot of power and authority to make decisions that affect our lives for good or for ill. And so it's important to study this. And it's still very vibrant. If you think about educational policy, right? Education policy, right? Vouchers, school choice, backpack funding, whatever you want to call it. These things have been very popular and are rippling across the country in the same way as you've seen other policy innovations happen. Things like marijuana legalization has happened. Things like right to work laws, right? And states vary a lot in their policy regimes. And then again, it's important to study federalism because states are in competition with each other. In fact, one of the great things about our federal system is what we call competitive federalism, the ability of states to compete with each other for businesses and for citizens. And that actually helps, I think, sustain liberty in the long run. So what is freedom? And yes, it has been used and abused in our history, in many ways, quite Orwellian ways, right? So people talking about freedom in ways that sound a lot like actually coercion, right? That's not freedom in my book. So again, we're social scientists, so we want to have a definition that we can apply, and we call balls and strikes as empires. Our definition, though, is very consistent with America's founding, with the Anglo-American tradition, the Western tradition of what freedom is, right? So we define freedom as, the right that people should be allowed, individuals should be allowed to dispose of their life, liberty, and property as they see fit, consistent with the equal rights of others, right? So that's the whole notion of like, your liberty ends at the tip of my nose, okay? So as long as you're able to dispose or use your life, liberty, and property as you see fit, then you're free. When others are constraining that, you're less free. Now, we're looking in this study at public infringements, right? Which means we're looking at public policies that restrict our freedom. But if you were going to have a kind of overarching freedom index, you'd also want to know how much are you free from the coercion of private citizens? In other words, how effective in many ways is our culture and our laws at making sure that other people don't violate our rights. Because again, government violates our rights on a regular basis. But the reason why we have a police department is because we are worried about, and we have seen, the crooked timber of humanity causing people to violate others' rights as well. But we're not really measuring that. We're not measuring, say, the effectiveness of government at public safety provision. It's an interesting question, but we're really looking at, in this study, how does government infringe on our rights or support our rights? And then a lot of times, and I'll preempt this because people always want to ask this in the Q&A if we don't, which is, okay, well, what about abortion? Or what about the death penalty, which are kind of controversial questions. And we've seen this in the after the Dobbs decision, right? So we actually don't code abortion in the Freedom Index. We have strong views about this issue, but we don't actually code it because we don't want to have the Freedom Index be merely a debate about its utility, merely a debate about which side of abortion you're on, because there are two different stories, or many different stories you could tell about abortion. One is that it's a human person in the womb, and therefore any violations of it, namely abortion, would be a violation of that individual's freedom, their freedom to live, right? On another telling, the view is that a woman has a right to choose, and that freedom means that the woman can do what she wants with her own body. And then there's everything in between, as you know. So we do in the appendices have three different abortion regimes: one that's pro-life, one that's kind of extreme pro-choice, and one that's kind of moderately pro-choice. And that way, if that's an important issue for you, you could see, based on your view of abortion and including that, what the state of freedom would be in your state and around the country. But in the main index, we don't have that, and we don't have the death penalty for the similar reason. Okay. So, oops, going the wrong way. Okay. All right. So here's what the Freedom Index is made up of. So we look at 230 different policy variables. So if you think any one variable is driving this index, that's not the case, because we want to make sure that we're capturing the whole scale of freedom in the states. So that means looking at not just economic policies, but also personal freedom. So the index is roughly made of three areas. One is fiscal policy, one is regulatory policy, and the two combined make up a kind of economic freedom index. But one of the problems we saw with prior indices was that they didn't capture the totality of human freedom, which means also personal freedom. It means things like educational freedom. It means things like freedom from, say, violations of your property rights when it comes to civil asset forfeiture. It means the freedom to buy and use and exercise our Second Amendment rights. So these things are part of personal freedom. But as you can see here, our fiscal policy, and this shows the weighting in the index, state taxation, local taxation are a big part of the index, as is government consumption, government employment. In terms of regulatory policy, land use makes up a big part of that, but also health insurance, labor market, things like right to work, which is a big thing here in Michigan, a big issue in Michigan, occupational licensing, so on and so forth. And then when it comes to personal freedom, right? So we have things like incarceration and arrests that is controlled for the personal and property crime. So it doesn't mean like the more people you have in jail or the more people that are arrested, that's bad. No, that's not the right way to approach it, right? So this is when you have incarceration and arrests that account for basically what you might call consensual crimes, right? And then things like gun rights, gambling freedom, tobacco freedom, educational freedom, marijuana freedom, alcohol freedom, a whole bunch of different things. Now, one thing I would say about how we've looked at this study, because Jason and I have been working on this study for now 18 years. And no, it didn't take us 18 years to write one book. This is the 7th edition of Freedom in the 50 States. So we generally do it every 2 or 3 years. It first came out in 2009 while I was in Afghanistan. So Jason had to carry all the weight. Or at least he didn't have the burden of carrying me, maybe. Is that how you look at it? Yeah, that's more like it. Yeah, okay. So we've been doing this for a long time, and we'll be publishing an 8th edition next year. So again, I'm going to turn it over to Jason to talk about the weighting scheme, like how we got to the notion that educational freedom is 3.1% of it. and then how to look at the results. But one thing I will share is a story, which is that you might ask yourself, well, why is gambling freedom so high? And if you ask the two of us, because we don't gamble, yeah, that seems kind of weird. But we had good reason for it. But in the first edition, we weighted gambling freedom quite low. Because we had the first edition, and again, we've been learning each edition, we learn new things about how to do the study. And in the first edition, we had a semi-objective way to look at this, including like, were things ensconced in constitutions at the federal or state level? But we kind of eyeballed it when it came to some of these things, and we just didn't think gambling freedom was as important as, say, educational freedom. But as we changed how we did the weighting in the third edition, I think it changed how we viewed this. And again, what we've tried to do is get away from measuring things or weighting things based on what we think are the most invaluable freedoms, but we tried to have an objective weighting system that related to how Americans view this. So this is a good segue for me to turn it over to Jason, and then he'll turn it back so I could do the Clint Eastwood part of the presentation.
The good, the bad, the ugly. That's what that is. Okay. All right. All right. So now what we do is an almost purely objective weighting scheme. So we looked at the research on each of the 230 policies in our database and looked at, well, what are the kind of costs of this government intervention to the people whose rights are at stake. So we're not looking at the benefits of violating people's rights. So it's not a full kind of utilitarian calculus, but we are looking at what is the amount that you would pay in taxes between the worst state and the best state, and then that ends up being an actual dollar figure. So we got a dollar figure for every one of these that goes in and makes up the weights. And so with gambling, for instance, it turns out that Americans really like to gamble and spend billions of dollars a year on gambling, and also there's huge variance among the states, which also makes it worth more in our index. So some states ban it completely, and some states, allow a whole lot of it. And so that makes it, something that's going to, if you change from worst to best, it's going to be a huge change, right? Some of these other things, it's not like that. And we don't include things, obviously, where states don't differ, like whether you license doctors or not, right? That's not going to, every state does that, so it's not going to affect the rankings at all. All right, let me move on now to the results. There we go. So this is fiscal policy. Again, taxes, spending, debt, stuff like that. And you see here, Florida, New Hampshire, South Dakota, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania are actually at the top. The top 4 states there don't have a broad-based state income tax. So that's definitely a feature we see in the data. Hawaii is number 50. The highest tax state in the country, although they recently cut taxes. Actually, a Democratic legislature cut taxes there. I think even they came to realize that they're having some problems with fiscal policy. Michigan, number 11, so definitely well above average. And you can see here that state fiscal policy scores have generally increased over time, especially after the Great Recession, which is kind of interesting that states really kind of cut spending when their revenues dropped, and then didn't grow it again as their economies recovered. Then we see a big downturn during the pandemic, and that has a lot to do with growing revenue collections as a result of just the types of things that states were taxing while the federal government was kind of stimulating the economy.
So the graph ends about 22.
Yeah.
The data is from.
That's right. So the data go all the way up to December 31st, 2022, and that's date of enactment. So when the legislature actually passes the bill and the governor signs it, or the legislature overrides the governor's veto. So some of those laws may have gone into effect in 2023. So we should kind of think of this as the state of freedom that was prevailing early last year. Is kind of how to think about it. So there's inevitably a bit of a lag, especially when it comes to collecting stuff like fiscal data, which gets reported kind of on a 2-year lag. But we found some ways to find the most up-to-date data possible. This is regulatory policy, and here it's important to note that this figure here that's showing state changes over time excludes federal policies. The big one there is Obamacare, that had a huge impact on regulatory freedom, because Obamacare basically took the most interventionist state health insurance regulations and made them nationwide. And so if you did include that, you'd see a big decline in 2011 and 2012 when the regulations for Obamacare were adopted. And so this figure would look even worse. But when we look at just state level policy, it looked like regulatory policy was improving a lot. And then in the last 4 years or so, it's gone back down. There's been a wave of state minimum wage hikes, a lot of increase in zoning regulation, which used to be kind of like a California and New England problem, has now become a little more of a nationwide problem. So those are kind of things kind of weighing down state regulatory scores. But we definitely see that Great Plains states and some of the Rocky Mountain states are way better on regulatory policy. Kansas, Iowa, South Dakota, Nebraska, Idaho. Michigan, number 12, again, well above average. And New Jersey, number 50, which isn't terribly surprising, I think, especially for anyone who's seen The Sopranos, right? Economic freedom as together fiscal and regulatory. New Hampshire ends up number 1 there by dint of being pretty good on both fiscal and regulatory. Then you get Florida, South Dakota, Tennessee, Georgia, some familiar names there. Michigan, number 10, again, being better than average on both components there. And some deep blue states occupy the bottom 5: New Jersey, Oregon, California, Hawaii, and New York. Personal freedom. Here we see an uninterrupted improvement in personal freedom, which would be even greater if we included the federalized policies like marriage policies, for instance, that were made nationwide. And Nevada, perhaps unsurprisingly, is number 1 on personal freedom. I think they've been number 1 on personal freedom throughout our time series, which goes back to the year 2000. So we've got 23 years now of data. Arizona, number 2, then Maine, New Hampshire, and New Mexico. So a lot of kind of more rural states tend to do well on personal freedom. And then Michigan, number 19, again, above average. And Texas, number 50, which might be surprising to some of you, and is definitely surprising to a lot of Texans.
Yeah, and we have to go into the belly of the beast next week and report that because we're doing a presentation in Texas next week, and I already know that there's going to be a pushback, so we're ready. We're ready.
Yeah, we're girding our loins.
Yeah. Again, we're umpires. I love the state of Texas. I lived there for 10 years, but we're going to have to be on the defensive, I think.
Yeah, and even Texas has improved over time, but it's just a relative thing, and it's worse than the rest. And then overall freedom as together, economic and personal. New Hampshire ends up number 1, Florida number 2. Those two have traded off in our index the last 3 or 4 editions. It's either been New Hampshire number 1 or Florida number 1. South Dakota number 3, Nevada, Arizona, Michigan ends up number 7, top 10 finish here. Yeah. And the bottom 5, Oregon, New Jersey, California, Hawaii, and New York, number 50. And New York's been number 50 in every single year since we started doing the study. So New York is definitely the least free state.
But talk about how less free it is.
Yeah.
It's not just sort of near the bottom. It's really near at the bottom.
Yeah, so its score basically, I mean, if this means anything to you, those of you with some statistical background, its score basically means it's roughly a standard deviation less free than average on average on every policy. So really bad.
So for the non-statisticians at home, what does that mean?
So that means it's like it's as if New York on every single policy were in the bottom 30%, across the board. So it's kind of hard to do that badly.
You have to really try to be less free, right?
That's right. And it is personal freedom stuff too, like insane tobacco taxes, which would cause a massive black market and cause some guy to die on the street when he was arrested for
and it
selling
kind of
cigarettes.
belies that notion, right, that blue states are just economically unfree, but personally it's smoke them if you got them. That's not the way it is, right?
Yeah. The conservative states have some personal freedoms they don't like, and liberal states have some personal freedoms they don't like, and it's not many states combine all of them. So a lot of people have asked us over the years, because we've actually been kind of long Michigan in several indices. We've shown that Michigan scores actually pretty well in our index, and we'd gotten complaints from people like, why does Michigan do so well? It's an economic basket case. and what we were saying is, well, actually, he's definitely hit hard by the Great Recession, 15 years ago, but we would expect Michigan to start improving in the future, and economically as a result of its fairly high freedom levels and rising freedom levels. And I would say I think now that's starting to be confirmed. People are talking about the Michigan revival in a lot of areas. And it's worth pointing out, of course, our data do not include the last 2 years in Michigan. So unfortunately, you guys are going to go down some in the next edition, just judging from what I've observed coming out of the guys right over there. But I don't think it's going to destroy your ranking here. This shows how some states have evolved over time, and what we generally tend to see is that the worst states have gotten a little worse, but the best states have gotten a lot better over time. And there may be some sort of virtuous competition happening here. I mean, Florida's rise is just incredible. We've also seen in some Midwestern states, well, Michigan's had a good rise in freedom, but Wisconsin is our #1 state for growth and freedom since 2010. And I think that has something to do with the kind of shifting of the political tides there. State average overall freedom over time. This tells kind of a nice story that on average, freedom at the state levels is growing. And again, this excludes federalized policies. And what's interesting is that whenever the federal government gets involved in something that used to be a state responsibility, if it's Congress that's doing it, it decreases freedom. If it's the Supreme Court that's doing it, it increases freedom. So we're fans of judicial engagement and fans of congressional gridlock, basically, is I think the lesson there.
And federalism.
Yeah, absolutely. Let states handle things, because in general, it looks like states are growing freedom, with some obvious exceptions, but on average they are. So I'm going to briefly run through some causes and consequences of freedom, and then I'll let Will dig into Michigan. So when we first did this, we didn't know what we would find. We thought probably Americans don't care that much about freedom. Like, we're kind of weird. We care a lot about freedom. We think it's just intrinsically valuable, so we're going to measure it. But we were urged to actually do some statistical studies on this. And what we found is actually freedom has some beneficial consequences for both migration and growth. We found that in the early 2000s, and we found it in every subsequent decade that we've looked at, which makes us more confident in the validity of the results. So this is looking more at freedom as the dependent variable, as the outcome. So where does freedom come from? Well, some of it is partisanship, and it's just something that we found with economic freedom. So you'll see here, this shows on the x-axis how kind of left-wing a state is in 2020 based on its presidential voting results. And then on the y-axis, it's economic freedom most recently. And you'll see there's a negative relationship. So, the deep blue states are a lot less free on economic freedom. New York, Hawaii, California, Vermont, Maryland, New Jersey, Oregon, Maine, all those deeper blue states, although Maine is actually worse than it should be, are doing badly on economic freedom. Massachusetts actually does much better than you would expect given its partisanship. It's not actually Taxachusetts.
Is that because of AIR, maybe? No.
I'd like to think so. I think it's actually because New Hampshire's right there.
Yes, exactly.
So if Massachusetts went too crazy, the business would hop over the border. And they've been doing that for years anyway. And we see that purple states are just as free as deep red states. Some of these deeper red states like Wyoming, West Virginia, Oklahoma aren't actually that great on economic freedom. But we have seen one of the things we predicted when we saw West Virginia growing in kind of Republican partisanship about 10 years ago. We said, well, if our causal story is right, they're going to start increasing economic freedom. And that's precisely actually what we've seen. So I think West Virginia is going to kind of catch up to the other red states there. Personal freedom, we see just kind of a cloud, again, because liberal states are bad on some personal freedoms and good on some others, and conservative states are kind of the mirror image of that. And you see this kind of cluster of sort of purplish states that do very well on personal freedom. But, some red states actually also do well, like Montana and Missouri, West Virginia do very well on personal freedom. On the other hand, Texas, Idaho, Wyoming do badly. Freedom and migration. Do Americans value freedom? Yes, it seems like they vote with their feet. So we find that all three dimensions of freedom, fiscal, regulatory, and personal, are associated with subsequent net in-migration. So more people moving to your state than moving out. So we control for all sorts of things, and we can't break this relationship. The number one state for people moving out, more people moving out than moving in, consistently for the last 25 years. Can anyone guess? It's a good guess. Another good guess. Those are both losing people. New York. New York has lost over the last 25 years. I want to say it's roughly 15% of its population just in domestic outmigration to other states. And when we dug into this, we saw that they're going to Florida. A lot of them are going to Florida. It's not retirees going to Florida; it's young people going to Florida. The number one age group moving from yeah. Well, the hurricanes may put some damper on that, but yeah, definitely people are moving from New York to Florida. And it's
But
people
talk a
looking
little
for
bit
work,
about
for jobs.
them moving within regions, though, because it's not just moving to Florida. It's look, you got family, you got ties in a
Sure.
local area. You're going to move within that area. So we've seen that, right, where people from Chicago, businesses in Chicago, moving to Indiana, for example. They're not maybe moving to Florida or Texas, but they're moving to Indiana because Indiana has been, especially on regulatory policy, a leading state. Or they're moving from California to Nevada, or Massachusetts to New Hampshire, or even New York City. There used to be a real advantage that New Jersey and Connecticut had over New York State and New York City. Now that advantage has been declining because New Jersey has become more, social democrat. But Pennsylvania has been a beneficiary of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So these results actually sharpen even further when we look at how free are you compared to your neighboring states, and this becomes quite statistically significant. And this is just a scatter plot to visualize what I'm telling you. And this is the line of best fit here, and it's strongly positive. You see overall freedom in 2010 here. Then on the y-axis, you've got net domestic migration, state-to-state migration over the next 10 years, right? And so the freer you are to start with, the more net migration you get over the next decade.
So look how bad New York is.
Yeah, New York is the worst, other than Alaska, over that decade. It's no surprise people are moving to places like South Carolina, Nevada. Oregon and Washington have attracted a lot of people from California, because even though they're not that great, they're still better than California, and hence the finding there. Freedom and growth. Was Adam Smith right? Smith says that little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice, all the rest being brought about by the natural course of things. And spoiler alert, we find that Adam Smith is right. We like Adam Smith, and he's right here. Economic freedom is positively associated with is basically inflation-adjusted personal income growth, right? So we adjust personal income growth for state-level inflation rates, because states actually have very different inflation rates. And we control for region, we control for capital per worker, we look pre-Great Recession, post-Great Recession, and we find that economic freedom has this effect. We don't find that personal freedom has this effect, which is what we would expect, right? We don't expect personal freedom to increase economic growth. It does seem to attract people, but it doesn't create economic growth. And so that's kind of enhances our confidence that we're finding something real, that it's economic and not personal freedom. That's kind of what scholars would call a placebo test. And when we try to break up fiscal and regulatory, the two are so closely correlated. It's hard to tell which is doing more work, but we tend to find that pre-Great Recession, it seemed to be more regulatory policy, and post-Great Recession, more fiscal policy. And this shows growth rates and their relationship to freedom year by year by region. And, people have told us that these relationships seem small, but you have to realize that this is 1 year changes in growth rates. So for instance, in the South, if you move from, minus 0.4 on economic freedom up to like 0.6 on economic freedom, your economic growth increases by about 2 percentage points per year. So if you're growing faster than another state by 2% per year, you're going to have double their economy in, what is it, like 20 years, 25 years, something like that. So these are actually really quite strong effects, especially in the South, and we see the weakest effect in the Northeast for some reason. But in all four regions, we see this positive relationship between freedom last year and growth this year.
Yeah, I mean, that's one reason internationally, for example, why places in the United States that we consider to be poorer states are actually richer than a lot of European countries because of that growth over time. And so we've outstripped a lot of other countries. And then that is also happening domestically.
Yeah, the miracle of compounding, you know. So, so yeah, this is economic freedom. We really strongly recommend it as a growth strategy for states. All right, and with this, I'm going to hand it over to Will.
Yeah, and Jason, please jump in here. We used to call this the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now it's kind of positive and negative. We're trying to be, socially scientific umpires. But one of the things for Michigan that's been good, right, is the freedom growth since 2010, right? So in 2010, Michigan was 23rd in that year and 6th by 2018. You could see it's really improved on fiscal policy, for example. Some of the elements of that it's doing well at is cash and security assets exceed debt. That's a good story. Government consumption and government employment are below average. Land use regulation is fairly light relative to some other states. It had right to work, right? And so one of the things that will change in the next edition of the index is right to work. Now, let's hope that people in this state can get back together and get a right to work law again. That'd be nice to see. Things like light health insurance mandates. Again, the federal government has taken a lot of powers away from the states when it comes to healthcare, but there are still some areas, and Michigan is doing better there than others. In terms of civil asset forfeiture was reformed both in 2015 and 2019. So that's a good story for if you believe in property rights. And just to be clear, this is not criminal asset forfeiture, it's civil asset forfeiture, and that's an important distinction. Light homeschool regulation, better than average on gambling freedom. There's a constitutional ban on racial preferences in public services. That's an important thing, especially with the rise of wokeness.
Now that, with the recent Supreme Court decision, that's probably should be considered nationwide now in the next edition, but it has been traditionally an advantage for Michigan.
Exactly. Marijuana was legalized in 2018, and then small things like motorcycle helmet law was repealed in 2012. I always wear a helmet. I've never ride a motorcycle. I always wear a helmet when I'm on a bike. I would do it if I was on a motorcycle, but it's nice that people are free to choose, if you will. And New Hampshire, for example, is a state that doesn't have a helmet law. New Hampshire doesn't even have a seatbelt law. And this is where it's, and sometimes we talk about an aside on virtue and liberty. We could get into that maybe in the Q&A. But again, if people are free, they tend to be responsible, right? Because they have to internalize the cost of their behavior. And in New Hampshire, people have high seatbelt usage rates, but they're not forced to do it. Okay. And that's the distinction I think that's important to make. And then in terms of negative for freedom, right? So it's pretty fiscally centralized in terms of the tax burden. State taxes are high and local taxes are low. It's better when the tax burden is more decentralized, when it's closer to the people, particularly when it comes to education. Do you want to say, I know this is a big area for you, so jump in here.
Well, you guys had a big saga on school finance in the 90s, right? And I'm trying to remember all the details off the cuff, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I think the legislature suddenly decided to abolish property taxes, and then they were like, oh my gosh, what do we do now to fund schools? And then they, the legislature started funding schools, and then there was some additional initiative that capped school spending, because now this is state responsibility. So we want to make sure that the state isn't spending too much. As a result of that, Michigan has ended up with very centralized funding of public schools. It's funded at the state level more than at the local level. So we generally prefer, we give a slight bonus. It's only a slight bonus, but a slight bonus to states where public services, local public services are funded locally, because we think that gives people more freedom of choice about where to live. You could live in a high tax, high service jurisdiction, or a low tax, low service jurisdiction. You have a little bit less of that choice.
Yeah, without having to move to Texas or something. So occupational freedom has declined. You have renewable portfolio standards, and they've increased substantially over the last decade or so. And then things like low tobacco freedom, high taxes, strict bans. No private school choice yet, right? It would be nice to see this.
What is renewable portfolio standards? I don't know.
That is requirements that electric utilities purchase renewable energy as a certain percentage of their portfolio, or what they're selling to the customers. So it drives up electric costs.
Yeah, it's essentially a green tax. All right, so what are some kind of policy opportunities? Now, again, we don't do lobbying. We're a 501c3 organization, but these are some ideas that, looking at our study, if a state like Michigan wanted to improve its freedom scores, what could it do in the three major categories? So one is to trim spending. And I'm kind of a Milton Friedman on this. Like, it's always good to starve the beast that is government. I'm not an anarcho-capitalist. I do believe that government should exist. And there are certain things it should do, but government is spending way more than it needs to do that. And so there are areas in which it could trim: higher ed, unemployment insurance administration, health, sewerage. And again, this is relative to other states. So it's as if, like if you cut these back, you're going to be doing something that another state isn't, right?
It's not going to become Somalia.
Right. It's not Somalia. It's like, it might be, New Hampshire, God forbid, right? And again, in New Hampshire, we don't have problems on these margins. I say we haven't lived there in a while, but in terms of regulatory policy, right, allow full nurse practitioner independent practice and prescription authority, join the nurse compact, licensure compact. There's something about Michigan. You guys don't like nurses. And I joke because, of course, people like nurses. They're an important part of our healthcare system. But in terms of nurse freedom, which is also helpful to the consumer, there's a lot of regulations on nurses that other states don't have. So again, this isn't saying like, we're going to go to some type of like, kind of crazy system in which, pop-up doctors on the street, issuing prescriptions. It's like other states are already doing this stuff. You could replicate that and the sky will not fall, because other states have shown that. And then in terms of personal freedom, of course, like educational choice would be a really major thing that Michigan could do. And again, I defer to a lot of my colleagues in educational policy, but like, it's amazing the results I think this would have for our children, for our prosperity, for our country, because public schools, even though everybody loves their public school, they're not doing well. And even the ones that are rated highly are doing a lot more poorly than people think. And that's one of the things that's kind of a challenge for educational choice, is that people think their school's really good. But when you start to investigate what they're doing, I mean, I lived in Arlington, Virginia, one of the richest counties in the country, one of the best funded school systems in the country, allegedly one of the best school systems. It just, the delta or the difference between what they were actually learning in the classroom and what was just basically because they had parents that are involved and things like that, right? What was actually happening in the schools, I thought was net negative for my kids. And we were in allegedly, like I said, one of the best schools in the country. So we actually pulled our kids out of those schools because we didn't think they were getting what they needed to prosper and to flourish as human beings. And I think that we need to kind of overcome that, like, especially in places where it's like, well, but Friday Night Lights, and, I went there and my grandfather went there. It's like, well, look, we need to have a different approach because these schools are failing writ large. So again, educational choice will help that. And some schools will benefit from that in the sense that they themselves will get better due to competition. But then other students will go to other places. Maybe they'll do something that's more innovative, or at least might be an experiment like Khan Academy. They might kind of indulge in kind of different kind of bespoke educational opportunities. And some kids will just go to the, normal, kind of Catholic school or private school route. And some kids will just go to a different public school. And that would all be great, I think, to give that choice. And I'll close by just saying this, like, when you have essentially zip code assignment, right? You're assigned to a school because of where you live. Could you imagine if that was the case for your grocery store? I mean, people say like, but education is too important to be left up to the market. Well, isn't eating more important even than education? And I'm an educator, but like, you got to eat. And we don't actually have government grocery stores yet. Yeah. Oh, don't even start. What's that? Yeah, and how, I mean, again, like the market is good at producing things that are fundamental to what we need as human beings, right? Food. And again, I think that if we got to a system where educational choice happened, I think it would just be like grocery stores where, and again, despite what Elizabeth Warren thinks, right? Okay. the thing about, if you all heard about how Elizabeth Warren thinks that the reason why prices went up at grocery stores is because grocery store owners were gouging people. So that meant, of course, that when prices have gone down or then they've leveled off, that they just got less greedy overnight. Right. And again, the margins in the grocery store business are really thin. Okay. And yet they provided amazing service. I mean, everybody's got their beef about this or that. But again, relatively safe products, lots of choice, relatively good prices, right? I mean, again, the margins are pretty thin, so it's not like they're gouging you. Whereas with our school system, especially because there aren't those opportunities, especially if you're low income, we have a lot of complaints, okay? And the outcomes look pretty poor. So again, I'll close with that and then turn it over to our moderator.
All right, thank you. Lots to dig in here. So if you have a question, jot it down on a card or a piece of paper, and one of my colleagues will come and pick that up from you. Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a little advice for you when you go to Texas. So this was really well done. The green and white coming to Lansing during football season.
Yeah,
good
like
choice.
that, huh?
I don't. Maybe you're just lucky, but I would suggest maybe doing some burnt orange and white when you go to Texas. Maybe
There'll
you'll
always be those A&M people.
Yeah, I know. You probably won't win either way. But I should tell you, we did fix the schools in Michigan here because there are no poorly ranked schools anymore because we stopped ranking them.
Nice.
Okay. So there's no bad teachers either because we stopped evaluating the teachers. And so we've solved that problem, actually. Though I wanted to ask real quick on if I think I missed maybe or didn't fully understand how the weights were determined. So Jason, I think this is best for you. How did you figure out exactly which weights to make the most important based on surveys of what people said, or how did that work?
Just the economic research. So for instance, for
Okay.
rent control, we looked at, well, what is what are the welfare costs of rent control? And so that requires knowing something about dead weight loss triangles, and knowing that to estimate that, you need to know something about the elasticities of demand and supply. And so we looked at the economic research on this, and in some of these cases, we are working with guesstimates, right? Because some of these smaller variables, there isn't a ton of research, so we had to kind of make an educated guess. But the nice thing about that is that you can go in there and you can open up the spreadsheet, and there's a dollar figure for each one of these variables. And if you think that's wrong, you can play with it. And what we've tended to find is that you can play with these weights within reasonable ranges, and it hardly changes the rankings, really.
Yeah. So again, that's as you can see, Jason's a great political economist, but a lot of people might not know what he just said. Dave Hebert will know. So one way to think of it is kind of like to think of it as a victim cost, right? So the harms to people who would otherwise enjoy that freedom. That's one way to think of it, right? And so we're trying to measure the harm of the violation. So for example, if you like gambling and your state doesn't have gambling, we're helping us understand the kind of relative cost of that to you and in comparison to the other policies out there. So again, this is a way for us just to get away from just saying like, well, we think taxation is like 15% of somebody's freedom. We think education restrictions are 5% of someone's freedom. Well, who are we to say, right? So we wanted a more objective measure. Now, the thing he didn't add there is that again, similar to the first edition, if something was embraced by your state constitution or related to a federal constitutional right, then we gave states a bonus, or those policies had a bonus. Again, because of something that related to a fundamental, what you might consider to be a fundamental right in a free society.
Yeah, we had this whole thought experiment about like we know which is worse, a 1% higher tax rate, or the government decides to ban Zoroastrianism. So hardly anyone is a Zoroastrian, but if the government is throwing Zoroastrians in jail, it probably means something really negative for religious freedom for all of us, and so it should get some bonus, and that bonus is arbitrary. It's like a times 10 factor, So we do the economic calculus and we just do it times 10. And the reason we did it times 10 is it ended up making personal freedom roughly a third of the index. So that seemed roughly right.
I have a couple of questions here from the audience related to a recent time period where I think a lot of people were surprised at how little freedom we had during declared emergencies during the pandemic. Can you speak a little bit about how, what do you see in the data related to the COVID pandemic and lockdowns and all that kind of stuff and the curtailment of a lot of people's freedom during that period?
Yeah, so we have a chapter actually on COVID era restrictions, and other people have come up with these indices of COVID era restrictions relating to lockdown, stay-at-home orders, and mandatory masking. And so we've got that data in there. Fortunately, by the end of 2022, when we have these data up, all of those policies were gone, even in the worst states. But there were definitely some states, Hawaii and California, for instance, that had a lot of these policies into 2021, whereas most states had them through just a portion of 2020. And I think what we tended to find is that the states that had fewer lockdown policies were the states that do really well on the other freedom areas. We saw a very strong relationship there.
Yeah, like Florida, for example.
Yeah, South Dakota.
And here's a question about how you used state constitutions. And so in Michigan, for example, we're somewhat unique in that our state constitution specifically prohibits things like private school choice. And I wonder if would that change Michigan's ranking because it's a constitutional restriction on liberty versus a statutory one?
Not in this case. So there are a few other issues where we've got constitutional bonuses, like for eminent domain. So if your eminent domain restrictions are in the Constitution versus just statute, you get a little bit of a bonus there. Mainly, we included constitutional provisions that really kind of secure private rights as a positive whenever it seemed to make those rights more secure. So you can be more confident because it's in the Constitution. It's not going to change. But yeah, if you guys were able to amend your Constitution, then maybe you could have some school choice. I know Kentucky's doing that this year, potentially. So hopefully you guys are wrong and you can do it at some point.
So do you get penalized for those restrictions like in the Constitution?
No.
Not for school choice. Yeah.
It's just a reward. I mean, we might want to think about having that for the next edition, maybe about pairing that. But I do think that I think it makes more sense on the positive side to do it. But again, we'll have to think about it.
Yeah.
So another question here about Michigan, maybe something that makes it appear a little bit unique. I know, you pointed out on economic and regulatory freedom, the top 5 states are all deep red. The bottom 5 states are all deep blue. Michigan is blue right now and purple at most, but also ranks pretty high. So do you have some ideas about, is Michigan unique in that sense? And do you have some ideas about why that might be?
Well, New Hampshire is like that too.
Okay.
So yeah, New Hampshire's voted blue in every presidential election since 2000, but it also often votes red at the state level. I think that's what's happened in Michigan, right? So we see it with the Snyder administration, right? He was elected in 2010. That's really when we start to see Michigan go up because it was number 23 in that year. And then it rises to number 6 by 2018. So I think a lot of this is just a change of regime at the state level. State level elections matter a lot more than you think, and to the extent that people split their tickets, potentially you can get a better state level government or a worse one than you get when you're presidential voting.
Yeah, I mean, Jason's state is so weird in some ways because it's had really very pro-liberty legislators. So it has had Republican majorities, and in New Hampshire, it's not just like in Texas where there's a lot of Republicans, but a lot of them vote like Democrats in other places. You've had a lot of very hardcore libertarians as kind of important marginal voters in the legislature. But you continuously see at the national level, right? So it's Senate and House of Representatives, New Hampshire electing, pretty left-wing Democrats, and it's very odd. But at the governor's level, for example, Governor Sununu's been governor for years and years, and yet again, you've had these
And he
Democrats
wins like 65% of the vote.
yeah, exactly. And yet, it's more than likely that, there's a good chance that all 4 national level seats, or sorry, state level federal seats will be held by pretty far left Democrats. Yeah, so it's a weird thing. And again, it does show you, I think, the importance of elections not being nationalized, which is, Jason and I have tinkered with the idea that maybe we should be promoting structural changes such that you have off-year elections for state legislatures, because that might help people break the nationalization problem that they have, where you might get down ballot people losing because they hate this politician or that politician running for president. And so if it was a real focus on state level things, then the elections wouldn't be about like big national culture war issues. It might be about like, hey, what's the level of state taxation, or what are some particular regulatory things that are going on at the states. Someone before this told me that right to work is about a 60-40 pro right to work at the among the population. And so
That was me. Yeah, I told you that.
Yeah, you told me. Yeah. Not just someone. And so, maybe if that became a focus of an election, then, you might have different results than if something just gets nationalized, where it's like you feel like a vote for your legislature is connected to your vote for the president, especially as you've had more polarization and less ticket splitting. Although this year you might see some more ticket splitting than we've had in the past. But again, the other thing too is interesting, or at least we think is interesting, is some institutional structures related to freedom. And we haven't done this research in a while. We should probably redo the study. But at one point, we were asked by a state level think tank to look into the question of whether things like term limits affected freedom at the state level. And I think intuitively, a lot of people on the right of center would say, yeah, term limits are good for freedom because, it means you might have less professionalized politicians, or at least, they can't stay there forever and build their cronyist networks and yada, yada, yada. But actually, we found that term limits were not correlated one way or another with freedom, either pro or con. But actually, one of the things that was statistically significant, in other words, mattered, is how professionalized the legislature is. In other words, so we were in the Capitol today observing the great feast of democracy that we have here. And lots of other states, their legislatures went home a long time ago. Like they're not there all year round. And a lot of Americans, because again, they don't study politics like we do, they don't realize that in a state like Texas, they actually don't meet every year. The legislature does not meet every year. Yeah. And a lot of people scratch their head like, well, what happens that year? Does the state go to hell? No, it's quite the opposite, right? That's why there's that old joke about how our liberty is in danger when the legislature is in session. And so you could try different institutional designs. So in terms of professionalization, you could limit the amount of staff that legislators have. You could limit session lengths. You could limit pay. So Jason and I, yeah, exactly. So Jason and I were meeting, and I won't say which state, but we were meeting with the Speaker of the House in one of the states. And he was telling a story to us about how he had been traveling out to California, and when legislators travel around the country, they may get a few bonus perks when they visit state houses. Like we couldn't get on the floor today to see the wonder. They get that privilege maybe. And they were having a chat, one speaker to another, and the speaker of I think it was California, but I can't remember which one, said like something like, well, so how, what do legislators get paid there? And he's like, 100. And I was like, oh, 100,000. That's pretty darn good. And it was like, no, $100. Legislators don't make a lot of money in some states, right? They're not professionals. They're not meant to be professionals. And in other states they are. So, Jason's home state, the New Hampshire, they make a really low amount, and they get travel funding. So they get mileage. So if you're coming from way the heck up in Coos County in New Hampshire, you get reimbursed, but it's not meant to be something that you go there as a profession and that you make a big salary. It's meant, and so in New Hampshire, they have a lot of retirees and lawyers and educators that can do that. And again, it's going to affect the type of people you have there. But the fact is that the fact that New Hampshire is a citizen legislature, I think, relates to why it's more free. And the fact that a place like California has, is a relatively professional legislature, that's not, or New York in particular, right? I think that's bad for freedom. So again, there's lots of different mechanisms that you could use. Again, I liked in Texas when I used to live there that the legislature wasn't in session every year. It gives you some policy stability. And one thing that helps with is, let's imagine that you have a recession in an off year when the legislature isn't meeting. It acts as kind of like a pressure, a release valve, right? So there might be a tendency among the people to say government needs to do something, but government isn't meeting. Now, the governor can call a special session if it got really dire, right? And there needed to be a government response, but it does take some pressure off that. And I think that's again, a kind of bonus institutional feature. Do you want to say anything about institutions? I mean, you're a political scientist too.
I think also, having very strong bicameralism helps. So when you have a really large House and a really small Senate, I think that makes them represent different constituencies, have different outlooks, creates, more, if you will, gridlock within the legislature. And so it's more difficult to get things passed.
Yeah. Tell these folks how big a House your home state has.
So there are 400 in the state House and 24 in the Senate. So it's
Diversity. It's good for diversity.
yeah, I mean, you have 3,000 voters to a rep. So your reps.
Yeah.
Like I
Whereas-
I think it's more how our republic was intended when it was first.
I think so. Yeah.
I think so, and even the British House of Commons was intended to be that. It has 600 something members, but and the U.S. House was like that too. But with population growth, now they're much more distant from the population than they used to be.
Yeah. I mean, a state like Texas that has it's around 26 million people, 30 million people. Only has 150 representatives, and New Hampshire has like 1.5 million people and has 400. I mean, if you think about the federal level, I mean, do people feel all that represented when your one representative is basically is about 800,000 people in a House district in the U.S.? Compared to 3,000 in New Hampshire. Like, I knew my state reps growing up there. Now, again, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be focused on a free society, but at the least, at the end of the day, the person kind of has to look you in the face at church or downtown or at the grocery store. Whereas, like, how many of you could point out your federal representative if they walk down the street? A lot of people can't. Yeah. But you might never see them because 800,000 people could be, I mean, they could live really far away. Whereas, and I like the citizen. I mean, I'm not a Democrat in the sense of like believing we should have plebiscite democracy. I think a kind of a small R Republican form of government is the right thing because you don't want direct democracy for all the reasons we learned in hopefully at our good public school or private school. Maybe people aren't learning that. Yeah, exactly. But I do think that especially in one of the chambers, it's very helpful to have a lot of members. They're more kind of known people in the community, and you could give them grief or you could, praise them. And I think that's helpful.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. There were several questions that I didn't get to. So I know I'm sure Jason and William will be
we'll stick
around for a little bit if you want to ask questions to them. Thank you all for joining us today. Just a reminder, the Mackinac Center is a nonprofit private think tank in Midland, and we run on the support of donors, kind donors who support our work. So if you want to learn more about that, you can find out about how to support our work at mackinac.org, or you can just talk to me afterwards or one of my colleagues. We'd be happy to discuss that with you more. And before we conclude, two quick things. This was recorded, so if you enjoyed the event, please share it with a friend. You can find the video recording of this on our website. And also at the table in the back, you might have seen this on your way, and there's a publications area back there, all kinds of different literature, including stuff from AIER and lots of different Mackinac center material there. So if you find something you like, feel free to take it, share it with a friend as well. And I want to remind everyone of an event we're having. If you're in the Birmingham area, we have a movie screening coming up. Speaking of freedom, the movie is called Freedom Hair, and it's about a woman who tried to do something that seems pretty simple. She tried to open a business to braid people's hair and found out in Mississippi that's harder to do than what it might seem. So her freedom to just braid people's hair was restricted by her government. And this movie is going to be October 29 in Birmingham is when we're doing that screening. So if you're interested in that, check that out as well. Thanks very much for coming. We hope to see you again real soon.